I can remember as a young boy, indeed as a very, very young boy, hearing adults complain about taxes. And I didn't know exactly what they meant by that word, but I knew it was a very, very bad thing. And then in 5th grade, I had a teacher who made the point one day that taxes were not all bad, that it's with tax money that roads are built and taxes pay the police and pay for us to have a military that protect us, and so there's a lot of good things that come from taxes. Then when I was in college, I began to work summers for a moving van and storage company, and I remember the first time I got a paycheck. I worked 12-hour days moving furniture, and it was very, very, to me, it was very, very hard work all day long, hot summer. And I got this paycheck, and I saw the sort of gross earnings, and then I saw that nearly 1/3 of it had been taken out in taxes, Social Security and state and federal taxes, and I was absolutely flabbergasted that 1/3 of my labor, all that sweat and toil, was going somewhere else. And I remember thinking, by what right are they taking all my money from me? Well, the problem with taxation is not a new one. Indeed, I think it's correct to understand the founding of our republic as being a tax revolt. There's some irony in that, but it's the case that it was rebellion against taxation and resistance to taxation, and questions being raised about the nature of civil authority and the rights of the civil authority go back deep into the bowels of antiquity, as far back as recorded history goes. In Judea at the time of Jesus, the Roman rule had been established for decades, and Roman tribute had been required from 6 AD following. This provoked a tremendous resentment and even insurrection resistance on the part of the population of Judea. The people that we call zealots, identified as such in the New Testament, are really a collection of different peoples, all of whom were anti-Roman and anti-tax. Tax collectors, as you may be aware, were universally despised in the first century in Judea. Taxes were seen as a symbol of subjugation, and because it was the people of God who were being ruled over by pagans, it was seen as an affront to God himself. And so they were raising that same issue. By what right can Caesar require of God's people that they pay taxes? One of the commentators refers to the emotional trauma that pervaded the whole issue of taxation. And so that's the context within which the question is being raised that is put to Jesus in the opening verses of our passage. In Matthew 22, verse 15, we read that then the Pharisees went and they counseled together how they might trap him in what he had said. They counseled together. They're being very careful. They're trying to find some way to trap him. That word trap is taken from the realms of fishing and of hunting, and they want to catch him. They want to ensnare him somehow. And so they're being very clever to think of a question that they can ask that will cause Jesus to stumble and to get in trouble in one form of trouble or another. In other words, they're coming to him without the intent of actually learning something. They're not there for clarification respecting his views. They're not there in pursuit of the truth. The point is they want to discredit and ultimately destroy him. That's the reason behind the question. And they sent their disciples, these leading Pharisees, apparently not having the courage to go themselves, but sending their underlings, student Pharisees, to him, along with the Herodians. There's a little surprise there. We don't know a whole lot about the Herodians except what's implied by the name. A Herodian, obviously, would be those who were supporters of the Herodian dynasty, the dynasty of the Herods. In other words, the Herodians are collaborators. They are pragmatists. They're saying, look, we have Roman rule. We might as well get along with it. We might as well support the dynasty, work with them, benefit and profit from their rule as much as we can. A person, after all, has got to get along in the world, don't they? They would have been despised by the Pharisees normally. The Pharisees were not pragmatists at all. They were people of principle. They weren't collaborators. They bitterly resented and resisted the Roman rule. And so if we see the two of them together, we know something's up. Politics makes strange bedfellows, as they say. And so they are working together, those who would not have had anything to do with each other. It's not unlike, as a matter of fact, not unlike the collaboration between the secular Middle Eastern Muslims and the fanatical Islamists, say the Baathists in Iraq and the followers of Osama bin Laden, the Al-Qaeda network. Normally they despise each other. They absolutely despise the secularists like Saddam Hussein as having compromised the principles of Islam. But with a common enemy, you see, they're united. They're working together. They're collaborating at one level or another against a common foe. And that is the way that they see Jesus, these Herodians and these Pharisees. Normally they wouldn't give each other the time of day, as we would say. But they are united by their opposition to the ministry of Jesus. And so we read in verse 16 that it's the disciples of the Pharisees along with the Herodians. They come to Jesus and they raise their question. Teacher, they say. That's a title of respect. We know that you are truthful, literally, that you are true. In other words, you are a person of truth down into the core of your being. You're reliable. You're a person of integrity. You teach the way of God in truth. That's a remarkable concession on their part. Obviously, they're buttering him up. You teach the way of God in truth, and you defer to no one, for you are not partial to any. In other words, you don't adapt your message according to the audience that is before you. You shoot straight. You say what's right and true, no matter what. You don't defer to anybody. And while surely they are buttering him up, this probably reflects the reputation that Jesus had at the time. This is probably what people said about it. And this was the word on the streets about Jesus. Jesus speaks the truth. Jesus doesn't defer. Jesus is, in other words, he is a courageous prophet, a courageous controversialist and debater. He defers to no one. And so they go on in verse 17. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not? Now, the point of all the flattery of verse 16 is that they want to trap Jesus. They want to add more pressure to what will already be a pressurized situation. Given that they've said, all right, you don't defer to anyone. All right, now we're going to ask you a question in which you might otherwise have been tempted to defer, because no matter how you answer this question, you're going to be in trouble. If you say, in answer to our question about whether or not it is lawful to pay the poll tax, that is the tribute money that Caesar was requiring, if you say, no, don't pay the tax, you're going to be in trouble with the Roman authorities. They will see you as an insurrectionist. You will be arrested. You may be put to death. If, on the other hand, you say, yes, go ahead and pay the tax, you will become unpopular with the people, because the people hate the tax. The people don't want to pay the tax. And since you defer to no one, now you're going to have to answer our difficult question. And as you answer this question, you're going to find yourself between a rock and a hard place, unable to answer without getting yourself in trouble with one group or the other. And further compounding the situation is the fact that the tribute money, the poll tax, was itself idolatrous. That is, the coin itself. On one side of the coin, it identified Caesar as Tiberius. This is Caesar Tiberius, son of divine Augustus. Several in succession from Caesar Augustus. Caesar was the household name of Julius Caesar, but beginning with Octavian, who took the family name, added to it Augustus, all of the emperors of Rome thereafter used Julius's household family name as part of his title. And so it was Caesar Tiberius, or Tiberius Caesar, son of divine Augustus. That's an idolatrous claim. That's on the coin, the denarius. They allowed the people of Judea, for ordinary transactions to use copper coins that didn't make that claim, but for the poll tax, they had to pay it with a denarius. So that compounds the problem. The other side of the coin had the picture of Tiberius, in which it identified him as Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, highest priest, an affirmation of his priesthood, another blasphemous or idolatrous claim that's being made. And so Jesus finds himself ensnared on the horns of a dilemma. Does he say, pay it, and then alienate himself from the people? Does he say, don't pay it, and be arrested as a subversive? And in his answer, in verses 18 and following, he not only cleverly evades the trap, but he also, at the same time, remarkably, provides principles that have guided church and state questions for the last 2,000 years. In fact, probably it could be argued, and I would certainly affirm this, these are the most important words ever spoken on the issue of church and state in the history of the human race. What does Jesus say? We begin at verse 18 then. Jesus perceived their malice. He knows what they're up to. The word malice is really the word evil. He knows exactly what they're up to. He knows what their intentions are. And he says in verse 18, why are you testing me? You see, that's what you're up to. This is a test. This is not pursuit of the truth. You're pretending one thing. You're hypocrites. You're pretending to be seekers after truth. And in fact, you're intending another. You want to destroy me. That's really what this is about. So perceiving their malice, he said in verse 18, why are you testing me, you hypocrites? Verse 19, show me the coin used for the poll tax. And so they brought him not one of the copper coins, but a denarius. So they had a denarius, didn't they? They were using the denarius. They were able to put their hands on one. It's obvious that they are making use of these coins in order to pay the poll tax and perhaps for other transactions as well. And he said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? Whose likeness? Well, the likeness was that of Tiberius. And whose inscription? These words of Pontifex Maximus and Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus. Well, it's obvious. And they answer in verse 21, Caesar's. That's right. That's Caesar's. So they brought to him the denarius, the little 25-cent silver coin. The likeness and inscription is that of Caesar's. The implication being, whose coinage are you using? It's Caesar's coinage you're using, is it not? The power to create currency is a power that has always been recognized as a sign of legitimacy of any civil authority. The civil authority that is able to coin money, create currency, regulate the currency, is the legitimate authority in a given nation. It's part of the way in which we still today define distinct nationhood, is the power to create currency. And so their use of that currency is a sign of their acceptance of Roman authority. That would be the point that Jesus is making. Whose coins are you using? If you're using them, then you've accepted Roman rule. And if you have accepted Romans rule, then the principle of verse 21 necessarily follows. Then he said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. If you're going to use coin whose likeness and inscription is that of Caesar's, then you have accepted the rule of Caesar, and now you must render to Caesar. There's two important principles that Jesus is expressing here. Number one, Caesar has a legitimate realm. Over against the claims of anarchists and revolutionaries, Caesar has a legitimate realm. Render is a word that means pay what is owing. It implies a debt. Something here is legitimately due that ought to be paid and that Caesar has a right to collect. All right. What is the basis then of Caesar's legitimacy? It's twofold. Caesar has a legitimate realm, but upon what is his legitimacy established? Why this Caesar, not some other Caesar? One, legitimacy is based upon the divinely sanctioned office of the civil magistrate. Now follow me here as we just digress a little bit. God is the one who established civil authority. You go all the way back to Genesis 9:6 in the aftermath of the flood. In order to prevent the escalation of violence, as has happened in the days of Noah, God instituted civil government. Genesis 9:6 says that if man sheds blood, by man his blood shall be shed. That has long been seen as the foundation of civil authority. In other words, you murder someone, God is sanctioning the state, an entity, that is, an entity by which the whole judicial process ending in execution could be established. In other words, all of the legal and judicial and military and policing authority of the state goes back to Genesis 9:6. It is of divine origin and divine design that we are governed by civil authority. The Apostle Paul supports this interpretation in Romans 13. Listen to what he says. Romans 13:1, let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Civil authority, established by God. Let's go on a little bit further in what the Apostle Paul writes, verse 4. He says of the civil authority that it is a minister of God. Now that's an exalted term. A servant of God, a minister of God, to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword. There's the grant of power. It bears the sword. Rightly it bears the sword. Why? Because it's being charged with the legal and judicial and policing and military functions by which evil is to be punished and good is to be protected. Whereby the evildoers are to be punished and the innocent are to be protected from their evil doing. It is a minister of God to you for good, but if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. It is a minister of God, he says again, an avenger who brings wrath upon the one who practices evil. Skipping down to verses 6 and 7 of Romans 13, for because of this you also pay taxes. This is the Apostle Paul interpreting Jesus' words here. Is because of this you pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Therefore, he writes, render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. In other words, Caesar has a legitimate realm. He has a legitimate role. It's God ordained and God sanctioned, God established, and therefore Christian people owe to the civil authorities, and indeed all people owe to the civil authorities, their taxes, honor, and obedience. So, Caesar has a legitimate realm. That legitimacy is based upon divinely sanctioned office. Secondly, legitimacy is related to the consent of the governed. Now, it'd be wrong to understand consent here in the full sense that John Locke later develops it. But there's clearly here implied consent. You've accepted the coins. That's the whole point. Whose inscription and likeness is this? Whose coins are you using? You have consented to benefit from the use of their currency. You therefore are required to submit yourself to their authority. Consent can take any number of different forms. There can be a written constitution by which we consent, as in this country, an unwritten constitution, as in England's case. It can be by common law. It can be by election. It can be by acquiescence. Here it was by accepting the coinage. There was a measure of consent. Legitimacy is related to, in some way, some measure of consent by those who are governed. And so the point is that Caesar has a legitimate realm, and he's due tax, he's due respect, he's due honor, he's due obedience. That's not an easy message to receive in a post-Vietnam, post-Watergate era in which we are cynical about the civil authorities, especially in the media and in the press, where our leaders are subject to ridicule and scorn and are dishonored on a daily, if not moment-by-moment basis. And nevertheless, we see here the attitude of the Christian church. They are ministers and servants of God to whom honor and respect and tax and obedience is due. So, Caesar has a legitimate realm, and yet Caesar's realm is limited. Now, that's the other side of the coin, metaphorically speaking. He says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and then what? And to God, the things that are God's. Render to God the things that are God's. There's Caesar's realm, there are Caesar's things, but those things are sharply limited by the second half of the verse. There then are the things of God, and they are not correlatives. We're not to see an equivalence here between Caesar and God. Once Jesus identifies that Caesar is not God, then Caesar is placed under God. You say, well, whoever thought that Caesar was God? Well, just about everybody. That's who thought Caesar was God. By Jesus saying that there is God and there is Caesar, and they're not the same thing, he's saying something very, very important, vital, crucial in the history of the whole human race. Because that's been more than not typically the view. Go back into the ancient world, the ancient Hittite Empire. Go back to the ancient Assyrians, the ancient Babylonians, the ancient Medes, the ancient Persians, the ancient Romans. What did they all say about their leaders? Their leaders were the offspring of the gods. Every one of them. Even into the modern times, the emperor of China in the 20th century, the emperor of Japan, in some sense, even to the present moment, is regarded as divine, and since divine, therefore, exercising a power that is absolute. You know, in that British comedy where, was it Horace, whatever his name is, says about his wife that she is that one who must be obeyed, she who must be obeyed? That's typically been the view of civil authority. He who must be obeyed, because they are the offsprings of God, they're divine. And Jesus is saying here, no, Caesar is not God. Caesar is finite. He is not divine. He does not have absolute power. He is not God, and if he's not God, then he's under God. I mean, by definition, this would be so. If there's God and God is not Caesar, then Caesar is under God, and therefore accountable to God, and therefore limited in the scope of his power and authority. And so that means, for example, that when we come in conflict with the state, as was the case in the days of the Roman Empire, and has been the case repeatedly, over and over, and even into the present day, then we respond like Peter responded in Acts 5:29. We must obey God rather than men. Why? Because Caesar's not God, and men are mere men, and they're not the offsprings of the gods, and they don't have absolute authority. And so when the limited and finite authority of human Caesars comes into conflict with the absolute and infinite authority of God, the human leaders give way. And so Caesar's power is a limited power, and Caesar is subject to God, just like everything else in creation. That means that he is obligated to carry out God's law. He is one who must punish evil and protect the innocent. And his powers are restricted to his ordained realm. That is, the realms of the legal and of the judicial and of the policing and of the military. And then thirdly, we're looking now under the whole category of Caesar's realm as a limited, though legitimate realm. That Caesar is not God, Caesar is subject to God. And then third, church and state are institutionally separate and distinct. The church does not run the state does not run the church. Among the things of Caesar is not the church. He does not have the right to control the church or to regulate the church or to tax the church. They are separate institutions. I would argue they've always been separate institutions. The whole idea of there being a theocracy is something of a misnomer. Not even ancient Israel was in that respect a theocracy. The kings were not the priests were not the kings. Saul's throne was dissolved because of his violation of this principle. He tried to exercise priestly powers. Uzziah was struck with leprosy because he likewise tried to assume the role of the priest. And in ancient Israel, the institution of the priesthood and the institution of the kingship were separate and distinct. That also is the implication of what Jesus says here. Now, there's going to be tensions, of course. There's a lot of overlap. Moral questions. Are they religious questions or are they political questions? Are they matters of the state or are they matters of the church? So there's overlap. There's going to be conflict. There's going to be tension. And yet, clearly the implication of his words here are that church and state are institutionally separate and distinct. The church does not control the state. The state does not control the church. They're the things that are God's. They're the things that are Caesar's, and the things of the church are not among the things over which Caesar has jurisdiction. Conclusion. Number one, honor the king. 1 Peter 2:17. Honor the king. Why? Because God commands it. Our loyalty to God does not require disloyalty to the king. In fact, the opposite. And so we honor to the king, to pay his taxes and obey his laws. Secondly, honor God. First and above all, and when there is conflict between the two, we obey God rather than men. We defer not to Caesar, but to God. Applying this principle today, where would the greater danger be? The greater danger be that Caesar is going to overtake the church, or that the church is going to overtake and control Caesar? Is that the church is somehow going to grab hold of the apparatus of the state and run the state? Or is it that the state will seize control of the institution of the church and make it subordinate to it and make it a vehicle of its policy? In terms of the principle that we ought not to strain gnats as we swallow camels, I believe that there's a danger in both directions. There always has been. But surely today, the idea of the church controlling the state is like a gnat over against a camel in terms of likelihood. It's indeed remote. I mean, aside from media hysteria, there is what church would control the state? We have 10,000 times 10,000 churches in this country. Which church is going to control the state? It seems to me that the danger that we need to be alert to as Christian people is the opposite danger. That Caesar will attempt to assume jurisdiction and authority over the things of God. That the state will come to attempt to control the church. And we see signs of that already. Of an overreaching, absolutizing state or civil government. So that taxation is being used to deprive the church of its resources. Zoning laws are being used to restrict the church's mission. There are neighborhoods all over America where churches cannot be established because the communities won't zone for them. And so they become impenetrable for the church. Our hiring practices are being affected by civil rights laws. There are churches that have had to go to court in order to fight for the right to hire only Orthodox Christian believers. Hate crime legislation is being used to limit and restrict the Christian message. So that there are Western nations now where if you criticize the lifestyles of certain peoples and their moral conduct and behavior and label it as sinful and evil, that you are subject to prosecution for violation of hate crimes and discriminatory and prejudicial behavior. Lawsuits are being used to limit the church's ability to control its membership and exercise discipline. And as Richard John Newhouse has rightly pointed out, an institution that no longer controls its own membership, no longer able to define its own membership, in fact has ceased to exist as a distinct and separate entity. Because the membership now is open to whomever the overreaching authority is determined can belong to that institution. And so it seems to me that the greater danger today is that Caesar will claim for himself the power to control the church. And that if there's going to be liberty that is destroyed in our day, it seems to me that the whole direction of things, yes, there's the gnat of possibility that maybe the church would somehow seize hold of the apparatus of the state, but the far greater danger is that the state will continue to encroach upon the realm of the church. And the great destroyer of liberty in our times, going back through the beginning of the 20th century and to the present time, the great destroyer of liberty has not been the church. It's been the state. You say, well, what about the Inquisition? Well, you know that more people were killed in a given afternoon during Stalin's purges than were killed in the entire history of the Inquisition. The state has killed tens of millions of people in our lifetime. Whether we want to talk about the massacre of the Armenians and toward the end of the First World War, or the massacres that went on in the Soviet Union or in China under Mao or in Eastern Europe, tens of millions of people by an overreaching authoritarian state. It has been the great killer of recent times as well as the great destroyer of liberty. And so as Christian citizens, this is something to which we need to be alert. We must honor the King. We must also honor God. And in honoring God, that includes the necessity that we be vigilant in recognizing the growth of the power of the civil government and its potential to rob the church of its rights and of its mission.